So my dissertation is about the 1920s and 1930s in France. It's mostly focused on Paris, but I talk a little bit about a couple cities in the provinces. And it's really about Yiddish culture and the development of Yiddish culture in France after World War I and before World War II. I write mostly about cultural institutions. In the dissertation, in the book manuscript, there's more about the institutions than there was in the dissertations. The book manuscript is centered around the Kulturliga, which was the Culture League, which was this kind of transnational Jewish Yiddish cultural institution that had branches all over Europe mainly. It's a good shorthand. Don't yell at me. But in France, they had a branch in Paris, Metz, Strasbourg, and Nancy. Strasbourg and Nancy. And so I wrote about them. I wrote about the Bundes Yiddishist cultural organization, the Medem Farban that existed in Paris, mostly in the 1930s, and also YIVO, the YIVO branch in Paris that had a society of friends and an office in Paris on and off from the late 20s through the late 30s. Institutionally, that's what I wrote about. And then from there, I wrote a lot about kind of Parisian Yiddish theater and Yiddish chorus groups. I end the book thinking about 1937 because in 1937 there was two really, I think, cool things that happened. There was a Yiddish Culture Congress in September 1937 that brought delegates from all over the world. And also at the World's Fair that year, there was a pavilion of Jewish culture, but it was really about Yiddish culture that was on the grounds of the World's Fair. It was in this big. It wasn't a standalone pavilion like if we think about World's Fairs, like countries that have them. It was kind of like what we might think of as like a booth, but it was really a representation of global Yiddish culture, and that was put on in Paris in 1937 at the World's Fair. So that is kind of what I write about. It's really about Yiddish culture. It's about kind of performance, singing in theater, and institutional life. I'm really interested in like how people organize themselves and how people like live and what people do and go to. So a lot of it's like centered on that. Like I'm interested in like who was at an event and who gave a talk and what were people going to see and do. So that's kind of what I wrote about. Still working through final edits. I got interested in that because I was reading two. There are still two. There are others, but there are two that to me are like defining books in the field. One is by Paula Hyman. It's called From Dreyfus to Vichy, and it's really about Jews in France. And then the other one is by David Weinberg. It's called Crisis in Community. And it's about Jews in France in the 1930s. And in each of them, there's a couple references to a Yiddish theater group and then a Yiddish singing group. And I remember vividly going to the footnotes and seeing what those references were about. Saw some kind of little discussion in the footnotes. And then a couple references again, like in talking about Jews and Yiddish in France in the 1930s. And I was like, this is fascinating. I had no idea that there was this like thriving Yiddish scene in Paris in this time, so much so that there were like singing groups and theater groups, and then I later discovered that Maurice Schwartz comes to Paris. And this was all like very exciting to me. And I was like, oh, I think I figured it out. I think I figured out how to do Yiddish and France. I was like, I think this is how this is all going to work. So I reached out to people and I was like, I want to learn more about this. Where can I read more about it? And people were like, we don't know. We don't even know where the sources are to write about this. So it was from there then that I made it my mission to figure out where to find these sources and how to write about it. So it literally started from a couple of footnotes and two books that are still very influential to me. I don't think there's anything that I write that doesn't footnote these two books. Cite, I should say, these two books. And they spawn this interest in kind of Yiddish culture and like what was happening in France, which led to now a second project on the post-war years. But it's all centered on this idea and this fact that we don't necessarily think about France and Paris as being this kind of like hub. I don't know if I would say center, but definitely like a hub of Yiddish culture. There was lively things happening. The institutions that I were talking about, I think it's amazing that there was a YIVO, Arbeiterring, and Kulturliga in Paris. The YIVO's office, their last office, is right across the street from the National Library in Paris. They actually announced it. They're like, our new office is across the street from the French National Library. And they were like really active, and there was this very vibrant, very interesting kind of Yiddish cultural life that was happening in France. And yeah, those two footnotes really kind of, it's odd to think of it comes from a footnote, but sometimes for historians, the really good stuff is in the footnote sometimes. And this was absolutely, that's the story. Like, they totally inspired me. Also books by Nancy Green also really inspired me to take seriously and think seriously about like Yiddish speakers in France, and that there's something to be said about them, like from a cultural perspective. I'm very aware of the kind of like the political divisions that existed among these groups. But what I thought was fascinating was because I'm interested in like the cultural and kind of everyday life part of it. That the people who were creating events and doing these sorts of things, even though they were coming from these different political backgrounds, were still cooperating in some sort of way. And that was also another thing that I just thought was really fun to write about. Whereas the Bundists and the communists might be arguing with each other at like the level of high politics, when it comes to like developing a cultural program, they're kind of acting together. And I thought that was kind of a really fun way to think about Jews in France.